Hi everyone, my name is Corinne. We have two remote members with us today. Daniella and Vivian are joining us by Zoom.
And I'm Aaron.
And we are the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit. Are we using this clicker? Okay, so on July 7th, 2019, the Washington Post broke the story that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which we know as ICE, had scanned through millions of Americans' driver's license photos illegally without the approval of state legislators or consent from the individual driver license holders. ICE was running facial recognition searches in search of finding matches for undocumented immigrants. They were especially interested in the DMV databases for Washington, Vermont, and Utah because these states' undocumented immigrants can obtain a driver's license. So this is just one of the many headlines that we see every day about surveillance and automated decision systems, and they have an impact on all of us. So in this presentation and throughout the summer in our project in general, we worked with two main concepts, surveillance and automated decision systems. So we kind of had trouble finding a strict definition for each of these, but in general, surveillance systems collect data about the mass population, and automated decision systems use that collected data to make decisions. So in the previous ICE example, the collection of driver's license photos would be the surveillance system, and the use of those driver's license photos through the facial recognition software would be the automated decision system. Now, we might not think about having our photo taken for a driver's license as being a surveillance system, but we also don't anticipate that it will be run through a facial recognition system. And next, Daniella will talk about the kind of legislation that surrounds these different systems. You might need to unmute.
The City of Seattle and many others use these technologies, perhaps without considering the implications. However, in 2013, Black Lives Matter protests on systemic racism, violence in policing, and drone use resulted in the Seattle 2013 Surveillance Ordinance. This ordinance required a reporting process with new devices requiring council approval. Notably, this ordinance was the first of its kind in terms of city surveillance ordinance. In 2016, The Stranger reported that the Seattle police was using social media surveillance software. However, this technology did not qualify as a device under review by the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance because it was deemed software and not hardware. This led to community pushback and an ACLU national policy campaign, resulting in an updated 2017 Seattle Surveillance Ordinance. This new ordinance requires a report created by a diverse task force of stakeholders prior to approval and a master list of surveillance technology. In 2019, two additional pieces of legislation were introduced by the ACLU to help regulate facial recognition and automated decision systems. This did not pass despite there being currently no state laws regulating their use. Among our stakeholders are the ACLU, which works to defend and preserve both the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to us by the Constitution and other U.S. laws. The ACLU has had a long history defending privacy rights, both in Seattle and nationally. We worked specifically with the ACLU's community-centered Tech Fairness Coalition partners, DENSHO, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, also known as CARE. DENSHO works to preserve and share the history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans with the aim of promoting equity and justice today. CARE's mission is to enhance understanding of Islam, protect civil rights, promote justice, and empower American Muslims. We partnered with these groups specifically because of their long history of involvement in civil rights activism and because they represent groups that have been disproportionately targeted by government surveillance. The output created over the summer is a toolkit that the ACLU can share with community members of organizations like DENSHO and CARE who may or may not be technically savvy. Over to Aaron to describe the toolkit and our process.
So our solution to this problem was to create an algorithmic equity toolkit to empower civil rights activists to better hold their public officials accountable when using surveillance and automated decision system tools. And the reason why we targeted civil rights activists was because our stakeholders, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, noticed that there was a lack of understanding about how these technologies work. And even though these activists and these civil rights groups are most heavily impacted by the use of these technologies. And so we created this toolkit with three parts. The first part is an interactive web demo so that civil rights activists can explore the potential algorithmic risks of surveillance and specifically facial recognition technology. We also created an identification guide for civil rights activists to be able to distinguish between surveillance and automated decision systems. And we also created a questionnaire to equip them with questions that they can ask of public officials to hold them accountable. And this is a timeline of our stakeholder engagement. As you can see here, we spent a lot of time having an iterative process to make sure that we met with stakeholders and got their feedback throughout the entire process. And that informed our prototypes, and then we'd meet again with stakeholders. And at the end, we had a summative process of evaluation and feedback with the Diverse Voices panel. And now I'll dive into the iterative feedback process that we used. This is an example of the identification guide prototype that we used to receive feedback with data scientists and stakeholders. We tested the accuracy of the definitions and the representation of surveillance and automated decision system concepts and definitions with data scientists, and received in-depth definitions and explanations. We also tested the usefulness and the clarity of the toolkit with civil rights activists, organizers, and leaders, and we used a Google survey and followed up with meeting discussions. And the Google survey would first test their initial knowledge, baseline knowledge of their understanding of automated decision systems, their level of concern, and comfort with engaging on these topics. This is an example of a question that asks about their familiarity with automated decision systems and asks for a definition. We then tested their knowledge, understanding, concerns, and comfort level with testifying on automated decision systems before and after reviewing the toolkit. As you can see here, the graph showed that the toolkit was effective in increasing the level of comfort on testifying on automated decision systems amongst all of the civil rights advocates that were asked in the survey. This demonstrates strong utility. We also had follow-up meetings to discuss any pain points, additional feedback, or any other questions they may have. We received comments that demonstrated that the toolkit could have improved on clarity. For instance, some stakeholders, like the top two here, asked about what laws there are currently regulating artificial intelligence. Others wanted the use case scenario for the toolkit to be more explicit, and so we made sure to incorporate some of this feedback into our toolkit. And now I'll dive into the Diverse Voices panel, which was a summative process for receiving feedback on the toolkit. The Diverse Voices panel was a method created here at UW by the UW Tech Policy Lab to gather input on tech policy papers. We met with 3 different stakeholder groups. We met with race and social justice leaders. We met with undocumented immigrant rights leaders. And we met with post-incarceration support leaders. We recorded our meetings, and we had 2 facilitators to prompt questions and take notes as seen here. We asked groups about how technology affects their communities currently, what feedback they have for our toolkit, and what more they would like to see more of in terms of the information in the toolkit. Afterwards, the facilitators would transcribe the audio and find themes from the meetings for revision of the toolkit. And now that we've talked about how we created this toolkit, I'll pass on to Corinne to talk about the first component.
Okay, so the first of 3 components of our toolkit is the interactive web demo, which will look closely at facial recognition technology. Now, importantly, this demo does go into the inaccuracies and biases of facial recognition, but we want to emphasize that we don't believe that if these inaccuracies were fixed, the problem would just go away. We designed our toolkit to enable stakeholders to both examine the inaccuracies of technologies, but also think critically about whether or not they're appropriate for implementation, whether or not they're accurate or not. So going into the demo. How do I get the mouse? There we go. Okay. So, as I said, the purpose of this demo is to look closely at facial recognition technology specifically. So, on We used OpenFace, which is an open source facial recognition model, to build this demo. We gathered our image data from a data set called Labeled Faces in the Wild, which has labeled celebrity photos. A lot of facial recognition software runs on data gathered from the internet, which has a high concentration of celebrities. So in this demo, on the left, you have a list of celebrity subjects that you can analyze. And then on the right, you see the 8 images that matched most closely to them. Under each image, you see what we refer to as the similarity score. So that's how similar this image is to your current subject at hand. On the bottom of the demo, you see this threshold. And this determines how similar 2 images need to be to qualify as a match. So right now, the threshold is set at 0, meaning the images don't really need to be similar at all to qualify as a match. And the more, as the threshold increases, the images need to be more similar. So if we go back to LeBron here, and set the threshold to 0.75, we can imagine that if I were an employee of a police department and LeBron was my subject at hand, and I set my threshold to 0.75, I would have 6 suspects to investigate as possible matches. Let's say these images on the right came from a prior records database. So 5 of these images are not LeBron, but they fall above the threshold, so they're false positives and are highlighted in red. The only true positive is the actual picture of him. If I increase the threshold to 0.9, we are left with only 3 matches because they have to be more similar. Now, the art of choosing this threshold is an art, not a science, and employees of a police department might not have the technical expertise to choose the right threshold. If we choose a different subject, Paris Hilton, let's say, and go to the same threshold, we see that she only matches with herself at the same threshold. The research literature that we looked closely at this summer shows that facial recognition software is not as accurate on individuals with darker skin, specifically women of color. So when a white woman is the subject, as Paris Hilton is here, the algorithm is much more accurate on her, and so it doesn't give her as many false positives at the same threshold. Another interesting example is if we go to Jacqueline Edwards, an Olympian, and if we gradually increase her threshold, we can see that she actually matches more closely with someone who's not her than to herself, which further shows this bias and inaccuracy in the algorithm. So we also included 2 case studies of facial recognition use in real life as part of this demo. So the first is the ICE example that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. And the second is the use of Amazon's facial recognition software tool Rekognition in Oregon in Washington County, which is the county that Portland is in. They used this software in 2017, and they did not follow, Amazon recommends that they use a 99% similarity threshold if they're going to use this tool for law enforcement purposes, and it was found that they were not using this threshold. So this part of the toolkit, the demo, only dives deeply into facial recognition, and the rest of the other components of the toolkit will look more closely at surveillance systems and automated decision systems broadly. So I'll go and hand it off to Erin to look at the next part of our toolkit, which is the ID guide.
Okay, so once again, this identification guide is to help civil rights activists be able to differentiate between surveillance and automated decision system technologies. And every aspect of this diagram was heavily informed by our data scientists and stakeholders. For instance, on the right here, you can see that there are definitions of surveillance technologies and automated decision system technologies. And we received feedbacks from stakeholders that they would like the definitions explicitly on the diagram. And we also provide examples of surveillance tool examples, such as microphone, camera, public records, and we also provide examples of automated decision systems, such as gunshot detectors, facial recognition, and social media surveillance. We also provided some of the major functions of automated decision systems and illustrated it with personalized definitions, such as facial recognition works by collecting images and video from a camera, and it matches similar facial images, and that's called clustering. And now I'll hand it off to Vivian to discuss the questionnaire portion.
Hello everyone, this is Vivian Guetler. and I'm joining the team remotely from West Virginia. I'm going to talk about a questionnaire, which is the third component of the toolkit. In addition to the guide, the purpose of the questionnaire is for community members to use it to ask questions about a particular technology presented to them. This is how the final questions will look like in the questionnaire, with the major questions numbered here 1 to 4, having follow-up questions which are available in the appendix if someone has more questions. The goal was to make the questions open-ended and in layman terms as possible so that community members can be able to use them to ask about our technology. We also have a use case example, how law enforcement uses facial recognition software, which is to help community members know how they can use the questionnaire when asking questions. So for instance, when they go to a Seattle police meeting and the police are reporting about the use of facial recognition software, the members can use the sample questions below to ask about the technology. The use case was added as one of the feedback we received from community stakeholders. They suggested adding an example case that will help users know how to use the questionnaire. Now, the questions are designed in terms of categories. We have an impact, appropriate use, transparency, and accountability. The example questions for impact, for instance, would be who is most likely to be affected by technology? What are the effects of using this technology? And example questions of transparency and accountability would be how does a tool or system provide documentation about its design and functions? How was the data collected and who was included in a sample population? Other questions that someone can ask based in terms of data privacy and security, interpretability of the technology, and operability. For instance, questions someone could ask about data privacy would be how does the technology address privacy concerns and how will the data be stored and disposed? So this concludes the illustration of the questionnaire. And the questionnaire was designed to help community members surface potential harms in using the technologies. Now, these harms include privacy violations in the collection and storage of data, unwarranted surveillance by the use of automatic license plate readers, racial bias and profiling, disparities in policing, gender bias, stifling speech, and other civil liberties that may be harmed by using these technologies. And finally, the key takeaway of a project is that surveillance and ADS systems may be effective but have negative impacts on communities. And the next steps for this project will be to conduct further research on this topic and also implement feedback from diverse voices panels we received last week. And then finally, the ACLU will be able to distribute the toolkit to stakeholders and community organizations. Thank you, and my team will be able to take any questions that we have.
Any questions?
Yeah, definitely. Another example similar to what you just said was like the smart meter collection. So smart meters look at your electricity usage and try to, and try to like help you maybe be more efficient, but they can also be used to identify you based on like when you made breakfast, when you did this. And so I think the idea with our toolkit is that those kinds of examples that aren't as glaring would surface because you could come to see the privacy considerations. Because it's both the surveillance and how it's fed into the automated decision system that would be problematic.
Those questions that you set up at the last part of the toolkit,
Mm-hmm.
I thought are good questions that definitely need to be thought about in the community. But I guess my question is, do the officials using this technology necessarily know anything about how it works, or what the training data was used, and do you think they would actually care about knowing the answer?
Do you want to give that to Vivian?
Yeah. Let's hand this question off to Vivian. So, Vivian, the question was, the questionnaire had a lot of good questions, and do we actually expect public officials to care or understand fully how these surveillance technologies work? Vivian, you want to answer that question?
No, she's muted. She's muted also.
Yeah, she's muted.
But I don't think she wants to be muted. So we can, there you go, yeah.
She's unmuted.
Can we hear her?
So I did repeat the question, but we can't hear.
But you're muted.
Oh, okay. So Vivian, the question is, your questionnaire had a lot of good questions, but do we actually expect public officials to fully care or understand how surveillance technologies or automated decision system technologies work?
Is your computer?
All right.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to answer the question. Sorry, Vivian. Your mic isn't working. So yeah, absolutely. That's the role of the civil rights activists, is to hold their government officials accountable. We know that there is one research study that was done by our project leads where they asked technology experts at the city if they had any automated decision systems, and in their surveillance tools, they're required to have a list of surveillance tools as indicated by our presentation, and they said that they weren't really aware of any. And that's kind of the point, is not only is this toolkit here to educate the civil rights advocates, but also for being able to hold these government officials accountable, and maybe they could also educate their public officials about these uses and really have them think critically before they implement these technologies.
Yeah, adding on to that, in one of our diverse voices panels, it kind of came up as maybe this questionnaire could also be used within a community to kind of start conversations. So, right, like, will the official know the exact answers? Maybe not, but that can be a community discourse. Yeah.
So when it comes to finding the issues with machine learning
Mm-hmm.
models, a lot of them have biases, but in many cases it's a black box. We're trying to turn it into more of a glass box where
Mm-hmm.
it's interpretive. When we're talking to ACLU and trying to educate them to ask the right questions, have we talked to them about all these different types of models so they are armed with that knowledge, so they can then go back and say, hey, can we see that interpretive model so we can understand where those places are? Have you looked at those interpretive models? Is there an education path that's going on?
Right, like looking more at the engineering side of things, sort of like looking into the model and seeing where exactly, like what parameters could be tuned. Yeah, so that was kind of a conversation we had at the beginning of our project, was who was the audience for this toolkit, and we ended up steering it more towards the community organization, so having them ask the questions about like the use of the algorithms in general versus looking deeply into like the like neural net itself and saying, oh, if you had this change. But I know there's a similar project that came out of the University of Chicago that was like auditing the actual algorithms itself. That just wasn't the exact audience for this project.
And in the identification guide for surveillance and automated decision systems, there is a discussion paper as well. We didn't show it here, but we do go into a little bit more explanation about how, for instance, classification or clustering works so that they can better understand the different functions and some of the basic functions. We didn't go into statistical versus non-statistical. We got feedback that that was too much information, and we got rid of dimensionality reduction. But some of these core concepts we did explain further in our toolkit, and we provided a glossary of for the terms as well. So we hope that with that better background and in-depth knowledge, they can be able to identify new technologies better and understand how they work.
And I think we need to
We can do one last question?
I'm interested in this toolkit and how it could be used for different audiences. Have you published it, and if so, what license?
It's not published yet, so that's still sort of the next step process. And we imagine it might be distributed through the stakeholders themselves, so like through the ACLU, but that is still kind of up in the air.
Do you anticipate what kind of license you might? Would it be a proprietary kind of thing, or?
It would probably be open access.